Patty Seymour, who is a senior consultant with BioProcess Technology Consultants. Patty has over 20 years of experience in the biotechnology industry with expertise spanning the development and commercialization spectrum, including biologics and small molecule development and manufacturing, supply chain strategy, including and management and operations leadership. Please welcome Patty Seymour.
Thanks, Anne, and thanks, everyone. Hoping this will be a very informative panel discussion. I know we have assembled a very experienced group here from both CMOs as well as product companies as well as law firms who will be providing their perspectives on how to negotiate contracts and their experiences across different product categories. So to get started, I'd like to introduce the panel. So I'm going to do it alphabetically, not necessarily how they're seated. So the first one I'll introduce is Tom Deauville, and he's the Director of Biopharmaceutical Development at Coltan Pharmaceuticals, which is a biotech company located in New Haven, Connecticut. He has over 25 years of experience in the biotechnology and medical device industries, focusing on development, optimization, scale-up, and manufacture of recombinant protein products. His current activities include developing and managing partner and CMO relationships for the manufacture of antibodies, small molecules, and antibody drug conjugates. Prior to joining Coltan, Tom was the director of polymer operations at a company called Spinewave, where he was responsible for developing and managing partner and CMO relationships for recombinant protein-based devices and and combination products. He also held managerial and technical positions at Immunogen, Creative Biomolecules, and Ceregen. So he went to school at the University of Minnesota, where he has degrees in chemical engineering and genetics and cell biology and microbial engineering. Okay. One of the other speakers is Cohen Hellendorn, and he's from Fujifilm Dyson Biotechnologies. And Cohen is kindly filling in for Steve Taylor, who was unable to attend bio. So thanks, Cohen. Appreciate that. So he is currently the head of sales, customer account management at Fujifilm. So after obtaining his PhD at Leiden University in the Netherlands, he started his career as a molecular biologist and protein engineer performing research at several small Cambridge, UK-based biotech companies. And so when he was at Biovation, which is part of EMD Merck, he became Director of Technology Alliances and moved from a more technical role into a business development role. And then in 2005, he joined Avisha Biologics as a commercial manager with responsibilities for selling their services. And now he's responsible for all of their European commercial activities in Europe. So the fourth panelist is Justin Skoble, and he is the Senior Director of Technical Operations at Aduro Biotech, which is a very interesting company based in Berkeley, California. And he's their Senior Director of Technical Operations, as I said. He has more than 20 years of experience studying microbial pathogens in academic and industrial settings. He's earned his PhD at UC Berkeley in the lab of Dan Portnoy, investigating interactions between Listeria monocytogenes. I hope I said that right. It really just flows. And other host cells. Justin he did his postdoc at UCSF in Jeff Cox's lab. And then over the last several years, he's focused his efforts on developing vaccines to treat cancers and prevent infectious diseases. He's been working on GMP methods for developing live attenuated and photochemically inactivated microbial vaccines, and he's currently responsible for all of the CMC activities at Aduro. And so last I'd like to introduce Lily Vakili, and she is a senior lawyer in the Faber law firm and focuses her practice on representing public and private companies in strategic collaborations, complex licensing, research and development, distribution and co-promotion activities. She began her legal career as a member of business transaction groups at Sidney Austin LLP in New York, and subsequently joined Simpson Thacher and Bartlett as an associate there. So prior to joining these firms, Lily was director and counsel at the New York branch of UBS, where she represents the bank in connections with domestic and international syndicated loan and complex financing. So with that, she got her law degree at Harvard and went to undergrad at Minnesota. So Tom and Lily share that in common. So, all right, with that, so I just wanted to introduce them with their backgrounds, but now I'd like to move into the next phase of really starting to talk about their experiences. And I intentionally assembled a group of people who have very different perspectives, CMO, cell-based therapies, protein-based therapies, and legal perspectives. So now I'd like to ask each of the panelists to spend just a minute or two, giving their own perspective of where they come from the contracting perspective, and just what their roles are in outsourcing, including are they involved in the CMO selection, negotiating, the management of the CMO, et cetera. And then also talk about the types of products that they're working on, whether it's the cell therapies, MABs, or ADCs. So everyone in the audience can understand the perspective that they're coming from. And then we can go into sort of the details of the negotiations. Maybe Cohen, we'll start with you and just go down the list, or down the line.
Thank you, Patty. So I work for Fujifilm Dyson. Fujifilm Dyson is a contract manufacturing organization based in the United Kingdom and in the US. We've been working in this industry for more than 10 years, I think about 15 years in total, really focusing for most of our lifespan on recombinant proteins. We're an organization with just over 1,000 people, working with many small biotech companies, but also several of the largest pharma companies. And our service offer is really process development and GMP manufacture, supporting the entire life cycle of biotherapeutics. Our focus has always been really on proteins, and that is really my perspective today. But we also recently acquired a site in Texas, formerly called Kalon Biotherapeutics, that's more focused on viral vaccines and cell therapy and high containment products. So increasingly we're also getting into that market. The focus I will have in this panel is really how we as a CMO can build a strong relationship with our customers, having a solid contract in place that defends us in case something goes wrong, but also at the same time make sure that it does not stand in the way of staying best friends when we go to collaboration with its usual ups and downs, of course. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Cohen. And Justin?
Hi. Justin Skoble from Maduro Biotech. So I'm the Senior Director of Technical Operations responsible for CMC for all of our technologies. And we have 3 different platform technologies. We have a live attenuated microbial immunotherapy platform. So we engineer this bacterium called Listeria monocytogenes to secrete different cancer antigens. And then we elicit cell-mediated immune responses against these antigens to target various types of cancers. Aduro Biotech, that's one of our technologies. We have a cell-based immunotherapy that we've acquired called GVAX. It was developed initially at Cell Genesis, and we have those assets now at Aduro, and we're working to combine these therapies in pancreatic cancer. And we also have a small molecule program that's preclinical right now, a cyclic dinucleotide program. I'm going to focus today mostly on our Listeria-based products, because that's our oldest technology, broadest platform, and have the most experience with that. I've been with that program for 11 years and with Aduro for 6 years. And Aduro is a small biotech company based in Berkeley that recently had a successful IPO in April. So we're growing quickly and partnering off some of these programs. So we have a recent partnership deal with Janssen for 2 of our Listeria programs, and a recent partnership deal with Novartis for our cyclic dinucleotide program. So I'm responsible for identifying contract manufacturers, negotiating terms of our contracts, and then overseeing these contracts and making sure that they're successfully executed. So that's our introduction.
All right, thanks, Justin. Tom?
Good afternoon. I'm Pam Deauville. I'm the Director of Biopharmaceutical.
Tom, could you speak up a little bit? I don't know if can people hear?
Is this better?
Yeah, it sounds
okay.
Yeah,
I just had to turn it on.
Thanks.
Sorry. I'm Pam Deauville, the Director of Biopharmaceutical Development at Coltan Pharmaceuticals. Coltan is a small private biotech company. We're about 40 people. Been in existence for around 6 years, I believe. The company was founded with technology from Joseph Schlesinger's lab at Yale University. and we are primarily focusing on monoclonal antibodies and antibody-drug conjugates that are directed against various receptor tyrosine kinase targets and their ligands. Specifically, my role is to manage any CMC activities within the company. So whether that's generating the request for proposals, selecting the CMO, and then managing the CMO relationship after we've started work. And if there's additional external testing laboratories needed to support the CMC activities, I do that as well. Specifically, in terms of contracts and negotiations, my job is to provide any technical support that the legal or business team needs in negotiating an MSA or other contract. So for instance, telling them when we have a walking away point where this is our we must have this or we can't make the deal. Or where we can compromise on various things. So.
Hi, so I'm Lily Vakili, and Senior Counsel at Faber, Dyson, and Atrato. And we focus on representing biotech companies as well as CMOs. And so I kind of, have seen both sides of the fence, if you will. And, in my experience, it's always a question of balancing, risk and leverage. Who has the leverage? And that really dictates an awful lot of how the negotiations proceed. And what we try and do with any of our clients is to say, well, what are the issues that are most important to you? Because let's focus on those. We don't need to reinvent the wheel when it comes to contracts. The legal team should really be in support of the science and the business team, and should not, the tail shouldn't wag the dog. But of course, the devil is in the details. I'm throwing out a lot of metaphors. But the devil is in the details. And so you get into negotiations and you find that, the strategy that you perhaps wanted to put in place isn't going to work because, as it turns out, perhaps you don't have the leverage that you imagined you did have as a drug company, for example, if you're a small drug company and you need to move a process along quickly on an accelerated time basis. You have a different approach to your negotiation. So we try to be sensitive to, where our clients are at and what they need to achieve, and then we try and give them practical, effective advice to be successful.
Okay. All right, great. Well, thanks. That was great. Hopefully set the stage for where everyone's coming from. So let's move into the first set of questions that we'd like to cover. In my experience, and probably everyone on the panel, certainly as you move through the phases of development, the risk profile changes, and therefore what's important may change as well. So I wanted to start with the panelists and ask, as you do move through the phases of development, how does your approach to risk management evolve from a contractual perspective? And just talk about, what are some of the positions such as batch failure, IP, timelines, et cetera. And does the type of product that you're developing affect this risk management approach? And maybe I'll start on the way back. So Lily, if you'll start off, and then we'll come back down the line.
Where to start? Why don't you give me that first example that you made? Because I'm going to stick with one thing.
Yeah, so if we start with the phases of development. So,
right.
What would be the differences between phase 1 versus phase 3 / commercial in terms of your risk management?
So that's, there are huge differences, right? And I think we were talking about this earlier, that your negotiating strategy is really going to vary if you're at a preclinical stage versus clinical versus commercial supply. And of course, it always depends on where you're starting from. Are you starting from, are you a private company, a public company? Are you well-funded? What is your timeline? But that being said, at the preclinical stage, there's often, a little more flexibility there. And a little more flexibility in terms. But as has been said in one of our conversations, you have to be careful because sometimes you then have to live with those terms as you go forward. There's an expectation by the counterparty that the terms that you agreed to in your preclinical stage are the terms that you're going to be willing to live with in your clinical and commercial. And that's generally not the case, right? Standards change, the regulations change, the obligations of both companies become more stringent as you move forward. You think you have to have a very fluid sense, a good understanding of where you're starting from, and have a good sense of what risk you're willing to accept. Often the CMOs, of course, they do want to protect themselves. At the preclinical stage, it's very common we see, CMOs saying, look, we're not taking any risk here. Wait till we validate, and we're going to do so many runs, and so, by the way, if, we screw up, too bad. You hold the basket if we mess up, until we get to some further stage where we, the CMO, can be confident of the specs that we have developed together or that you have given us. And, of course, it depends on the type of product that's being produced, right? Are we talking small molecule, large molecule? How complex is the process? And is there new IP that's being developed? And who holds that IP? There are an awful lot of things to consider. I think that's why, when you start off having a good conversation with science, BD, and legal, gives you a good basis to start the conversation with the CMO. And on the CMO side, I think it's all about protecting liability and the ability to continue to work with multiple companies, not being blocked, basically. So that's my 2 cents.
And Tom, maybe I'll ask you just a slight twist on that too. So, most of your products are in early phase development, and so maybe talk about it from the perspective of if you're entrusting the process development using a platform process, and so you're not necessarily developing the process yourself, but having the CMO use all of their platform. How does that shift the risk profile? Where you're relying on all of their technology as opposed to yours in terms of batch failure, timelines, and so forth.
Okay. But I think a lot of times the platform process can actually play into what in the early phases you see as the biggest driver for us as a small company. I mean, a small company is always worried about money, especially if you're private, living off of venture funds. It's often not front and center, but it's always in the background, wondering where's the next set of data going to come so that I can get the next partnering package or whatever. So while the money issue is always there, the driver in getting there is actually time. The quicker I can get that tox batch to get my IND filed, the quicker I can get phase 1 data to put into a partnering package, that's what's driving the next chunk of money that's going to come into the company that we need. So anything that can get us there faster is going to help us de-risk our program. And oftentimes using a platform process, which reduces the amount of, especially in upstream processing, the amount of optimization you need to do or development. Sorry. That can help get us, 3, 4, sometimes 6 months faster to an IND. And that's significant for a little company like us. So, and if we decide that the platform process isn't right, but, there's a CMO that will work with our commercial system we've developed, but maybe it's a little more money, but it'll get us there faster. That is absolutely on the table. We'll spend a little more money up front to get the IND faster or to get the material into the clinic faster.
And I guess I'll maybe just one more question for Tom, and then Justin, I think this also applies to you from a timing perspective, what about the carrot and stick approach for timing? Because a lot of times, there's some unknowns. You set out the timeline. You're using a platform process, and things may not always go as planned. However, like I said, getting into the clinic as quickly as possible is paramount for a small company. So, what is your thought on using incentives to say, okay, you think it's going to be done by this date, if you miss that date, what's the, who's liable, or who, is there any compensation made because, again, you're being delayed, or if you come in early, should there be an incentive to say, okay, great, we can file 3 months earlier and get the clinic started earlier? I mean, what are your thoughts around those types of negotiation points?
I think we would certainly be open to them. I've never actually been involved in a negotiation where that ended up happening, especially in the early phases, because the risk to success is much more in the early phases, and so the CMOs, in my experience, have been much less willing to agree to something like that, and that's okay. As a small company, we don't have much of a stick usually, so we just kind of have to rely on getting a good scope of work and MSA in place that really brings out a partnering, getting them invested in us, metaphorically, so that they feel like they have a stake in the game, and that if they're successful with us in this early phase, then we've got a bunch more work coming down the line. In our products 5 and 6, if we've had a really good experience with this CMO, they're probably going to be on the top of the RFP list the next time. So the carrot works a lot better, especially when you don't have a stick.
That's a good point, and I think I think you made a really good point about phase 1. Your CMOs may not be willing to take the risk because there's a lot more uncertainty, and so guaranteeing these things, is not really reasonable for both sides. However, I think, Justin, you're in a slightly different position now, where your processes are a little bit further along, may be better understood, and applying the incentive approach, because timelines, I know in your situation, are extremely important right now, and trying to cut them down as much as possible is important. So maybe talk a little bit about that and how negotiations might proceed.
Sure. I want to reiterate that I think that depending on your phase of development, the size of your company, your financial status, your risk tolerance is completely different. We are now in phase 2B trials, getting ready for phase 3, and we're well financed, which is a completely unrecognizable situation from where we were just a couple of years ago. And our approach to contracting is I think, completely different. And in our phase 1s, we're trying to get proof of concept data. You're working with a process that's not been developed before, with unique products, and so we had to take the risks ourselves, work with time and materials type of situations, just to get a process developed that we could get into the clinic and get a proof of concept data. Now that we're there, and we're really looking towards later stage development, we had to switch gears entirely, look for contract manufacturing organizations that can support our commercial needs. And that's a really, that to us was incredibly important. And those contract manufacturers tend to be more risk averse. They don't want to impact their other clients or their other commercial products. And so there's while you're developing your scope, you have to look out for both your needs and their needs as well for coverage. And so how you get there is going to depend on their risk tolerance and a lot of times your financial position. So how much are you willing to commit up front versus how much do you want to try to conserve your cash and therefore make smaller commitments and then take more you have to kind of take more of the risk yourself. We have an experience with one of our contract manufacturers where they really wanted a long-term relationship in advance, committed. And we had to decide if we wanted to put the money down and lock it in for a multiple-year program that would then lead to a commercial supply or not. And based on the fit and the level of competence and expertise, we thought that was an appropriate way to go. And I think it's been a very successful program in that we've kind of aligned our timelines and our success together, because there's a commercial supply carrot at the end of that stick. So, or the I'm mixing my metaphors now. But anyway, so we found that again, as you grow, as your company changes, the way you approach these negotiations completely changes.
Sure. Okay, great. Now, Cohen, coming from the different perspective on the receiving end, again, as CMO often has different drivers, and what level of risk you're willing to tolerate. So, continuing on that, maybe discuss your experience and, how you approach some of these early phase projects versus later phase projects, and, what kinds of incentives or carrots and sticks you're looking at in order to assume more risk or, defer risk.
Yeah, thank you. In principle, we have, looking at the very high levels, 3 types of contracts. One of them is very light, 2 pages, preclinical, anything R&D related, no GMP. Flexible, short termination clauses in there, really because we know that at that stage our customers need flexibility, and because we are a fairly large organization, we can offer them that flexibility. And that works actually really well. Yeah? We are sort of at that stage still getting to know each other. How do the 2 parties work? There's a lot of scientific uncertainty around what we're actually doing. Yeah? Antibodies may be commoditized more or less, but we work with a lot of non-antibody products, and quite often it's an adventure you're starting where you're still learning. Flexibility is key. Now then, when we reach sort of the clinical stage with our customers, obviously we also have an asset, a GMP asset, several assets that need to be sort of protected, our asset plans. And the contracts get more complicated because we need to protect ourselves more against what may happen with our customer. And we found actually that our basic MSA is suitable from phase 1 to phase 3. Yeah, you may get some variations on the theme because, as was said earlier, especially by Lily, there are clearly differences between what people need, but the basic concepts are fairly much the same. Beyond that, of course, when you're talking about supply agreements, that's a completely different beast, and there's so many other things to worry about. That's a whole separate document. But it is that sort of going from real high flexibility early on to much less flexibility, more certainty in later contracts. That's the interesting journey that we see between the different stages. And so far that's served us well, and I think for our customers as well, actually.
Okay, good. Okay, so I think now we're really going to get into sort of the juicy parts. We'd like to start talking about some case studies. We're going to keep it pretty high level for obvious reasons, but all of us have gone through a lot of negotiations and have different experiences of things that have gone really well or not so well or could have done differently if you had thought through some of the terms. So, if we can each touch on things about negotiating if a batch fails, who's liable. If you have to delay things in the clinic happen. All the delays happen, and you may need to push something out because you don't need the product, or you need to raise money before you can afford to pay for the product. Sort of the differences between a controlled fixed cost model versus a time and materials, and have that kind of control. I mean, certainly IP can be a huge issue, and then getting access to information. So I think all of the panelists can start and talk about that, but I'd like to, I'll lead off and just give some of my experiences as well, for some particular case studies. Fairly recently, we're just wrapping up some work and, did a great job, negotiated the contract 2 years ago, or maybe even more. Really thought it was actually a very fair contract. Things have gone, relatively well. However, as we're writing up some of the regulatory filings, we found that there was some misunderstanding about access to information. So we kept hitting walls about, well, that's proprietary, you don't get to see that. That's proprietary, you don't get to see that. And we were in a situation where we can't file what we felt was a comprehensive IND without having that information. And so in hindsight now, I'll be thinking about explicitly saying we have the right to this information. And so everybody will be thinking about it years ahead of the IND filing, because just simple things like methodology. Okay, especially when you're using platform methods, that's fine. But to me, there's nothing proprietary about how you run an A280 method. So making sure things are clear about how you get that type of information, and even how they're running the method. So if you're not doing it in your own lab or have access to it, those would be some of the things that I would definitely think harder about, and whether that goes in a contract or a quality agreement. at least people can understand what the expectations are in terms of available information. And certainly there are things that are truly proprietary and are not made available to the client per se, but are made available through a DMF or something filed with the agency that you're able to cross-reference. So at least it's there. So really understanding, what you'll be able to see and understand versus what you'll only have, sort of referral access to. So I think, some of those things are going to be pretty important. One of the other points I'll make before, going down the line with the panelists, the batch delay or cancellations, I know are often a very important business term because certainly I think, as Cohen said, these are huge assets. And if these assets aren't being utilized, it costs the CMO a lot of money because if it's not being used, they're not making money and it could have been used for somebody else. So certainly if you're planning to use capacity and can't, the CMO, it's not like you can just put something else in there the next week. There's a lot of effort that goes into that. But certainly in the early phase of development, sometimes you think you're going to be ready to go into that bioreactor at a certain time and you realize you're not because the process hasn't been completely developed or there's a method issue or something. And so I think one of the things I've been very happy with in some CMO negotiations that they understand that now. And that if the process isn't ready, they'll certainly pencil you in or at least hold that spot and be flexible. But if you're not ready, they'll say, okay, well, we'll be able to move you into a reasonable next slot, not sort of at the end of the line. So, if you were scheduled to go in December and wouldn't actually be able to go in until February, they'll do that. They're not going to push you to the back of the line. And so that's well understood up front. No penalties involved. It's very clear. Because oftentimes these delays or cancellation terms are very onerous from a small company perspective. For example, can basically amount to the cost of a batch, which could be $1 million for basically nothing. So those are the types of things where I see the industry has really evolved and matured, where both sides really understand the risk potential and have worked collaboratively to come up with, I think, creative solutions around those types of terms. So those are two of my case studies, and we can certainly come back, but let me start with Cohen and we'll go down the line, and maybe you could tell some battle stories. You've been doing this for a long time now, but certainly there's some really good ones and maybe not so good ones that you can help the audience learn from.
That's a really interesting point. And let me first sort of say what my philosophy is on contracts. Yeah. Contracts are there to protect us. It's very simple. Yeah. We want to have a contract that disincentivizes our customer to mess us about. That's what it comes down to. Yeah. So we need to be absolutely clear that there are certain circumstances under which they cannot just walk away and say, "Oh, can we do the batch 3 months later?" Yeah. So that's a very clear line that we need to draw. Now, in practice, of course, we're in this together, and it's in our interest to make the customer's product successful. So, a recent example, contract with a customer. Customer told us, we want to delay manufacturing by 3 months. Our first response is, well, look at the contract, what it says, and what the consequences are for you. That's what we agreed to do in the contract. So have a look at it. And they turned around and said, well, actually, maybe it's not such a good idea then. But can you do something for us? Now, other customer told us, can you speed up our program a little bit and manufacture 2 months earlier? It's easy, isn't it? We sit down with customer A, customer B, and say, let's just for a moment forget about the contracts and just work this through as people who are in this together and come up with a solution that works for all of us and move customer A a few months forward, customer B a few months back, everybody happy. You see, so I like contracts. I negotiate a lot of contracts. I like it even better if we don't use it anymore and can just work through the problems and with a solution that works for all of us. But there has to be that disincentive because we've had too many customers who simply told us all of a sudden, well, we've changed our strategy a little bit. Can we just delay everything by a year and then come back if we want to? No, sorry, you can't because we have an asset slot that we need to protect. Otherwise, we don't have income. So sometimes we say no. So that's sort of the way we look at these things. Now, that's very easy if you have sort of large assets, a lot of slots, a lot of customers. You can build in that flexibility that customers are looking for. It means that our planners sometimes have a bit of a hard time, because they need to swap all these things around to talk to supply chain and others to make sure that the whole thing works. But in practice, that is, I think, the way that we like to work, certainly with our early phase customers. So sometimes you work very hard, you negotiate really hard around those cancellation terms, and they're causing a lot of stress on both sides to get something that everybody can live with. And then in practice you say, come on, let's work this through as friends and see what we can do best. So that's sort of my first example of a battle story.
I have to kind of agree with that. So we do spend a lot of time on the contracts, and everyone worst case scenario plans, and then really what we're looking for actually is this partnership where we're all trying to get to the same goal together. And there's no point in running a run if you're not ready to run it. And usually you come to mutual agreement on that. And if there is a delay, I think everyone works hard to make it as short as possible, but not do something that you're not ready for. And my vast experience with all of the CMOs we work with is that it is a partnership. We work together to get there and try to ignore the contract as much as possible, except for the payment terms. Everyone likes those.
Well, I think we're one big happy family up here. I mean, I'll agree. I think the majority of my experiences have been very collaborative and positive. If I think of a case study of actually during negotiations of the MSA, a good late stage example from a previous life of mine, we had used one CMO through phase 2 manufacturing, and we're, for a number of reasons, going to switch to a second CMO for phase 3 manufacturing and early commercial. And during the negotiations, one of the sticking points is always failed batch, timing, what are we going to do? And it actually ended up rearing its head in the definition section of what's an initial batch, because that actually tied into how all of these things then manifested. And I mean, a very understandable initial position from the CMO was that any change in the process, it means that the next batch is an initial batch. Therefore, we're off the hook for the result. And our response was, well, we're bringing a clinically validated phase 2 manufacturing process. You're going to do your own in-house development for the phase 3 commercial manufacturing process. And so the engineering run is going to be the initial batch because, we're not going to make clinical material if the engineering batch fails. And so that's where we started, and where we ended up after several rounds was that we would define an initial batch in GMP manufacturing. If the change was significant enough that it would require us to notify FDA of a change in manufacturing. And I don't think either party was completely happy with that, and so that's probably the good middle ground that was workable. It meant that we were potentially going to have to pay for a failed GMP batch, but it also meant that it was going to have to be a very significant change, and that if there were small changes, the CMO was still on the hook for that. And that worked in the life of the contract. That ended up working pretty well, I have to say.
So I'll stick with batch failure, and I think that really is one of the areas that gets very sticky, right? Because let's say in a context of clinical supply, CGMP manufacturing, from the drug company's perspective, we'd like to start from the position that you fail to meet specs. That's a non-conforming product. You, CMO, replace the product. So the first hurdle is often, well, what really constitutes, how are we defining failure? How are we defining nonconformance? Is it just the de facto failure to meet specs, or does there have to be some causal element, right? Often what I've seen is the CMO pushes back and says, well, it's failure to meet specs, and that failure is due to manufacturer action or inaction or failure to follow the manufacturing process. And of course, from the drug company's perspective, you want to come back and say, no, the mere fact that you have failed, that the product fails to meet CGMP, that by definition means that it is your obligation, CMO, to replace, refund, or rework at our option. And so at each of those stages, you get some pushback, right? You get pushback on, well, okay, let's agree that failure to meet specs means that the CMO is going to have an obligation to provide some kind of remedy. Should that remedy be at the drug company's option? If you're on the drug company side, yes, clearly, because you have your own strategy to protect. And on the CMO side, they want to do what's going to be most efficient from a time perspective. Perhaps they believe that they can rework or reprocess. The drug company may turn around and say, look, we're not certain about what you're doing. We want you to manufacture a new batch. We don't want you to rework. We don't want reprocessing because we don't want to have to deal with the regulatory implications of that and the costs associated with it. Another issue that the CMO will come back with, and reasonably, in many instances, is look, we're CMO. We'll reprocess or we will remanufacture. We will manufacture a new batch, but you have to provide the API. All right, we're not liable. We're not going to absorb the cost of the API because if we did that for each of our customers, that could put us out of business. That can be a bitter pill for the drug company to swallow because on the other hand, if they're a smaller company, having to provide that batch of API is expensive. In some instances it isn't. But depending on the cost that's involved, you get more. You'll have more conversation. I find that having a good understanding who you're talking with at the beginning, at the outset, and having the good relationship is really critical because at the end of the day, Cohen, you are right. Neither party really wants to pursue legal remedies. It's expensive, it's time-consuming, it's the last resort. So it means that practically people are going to come to the table, they're going to sit down, and they're going to figure something out. But you can avoid some of these problems if you have clear language to begin with and a clear understanding to begin with.
Right. And actually I have this is great because the train of discussion is perfect because I've had some pretty positive experiences recently along those lines. So the failed batch definition can evolve over the phases of development. So in phase one, the risk of a batch failure can be higher than later. So certainly I think most CMOs, are, at least that I've been working with, are pretty reasonable about what a specification failure means. So if you fail bioburden or you fail any of those safety specs, generally, it is the CMO's fault. I mean, there's no doubt. And it goes back, I think Lily mentioned first, who has the most leverage or who's in the position to control the situation the most. And in most of those cases, the CMO is in the position to control it. So if they contaminate the batch, I don't think any reasonable CMO would say they're not liable for that because that's fundamentally a GMP violation. They did something to contaminate the batch. So those are things. I think in phase one where it gets a little more dialogue, it's how you actually set the specs as well. Often, I've worked with some companies that want to set very tight specs at phase one, and we recommend don't do that. It's not required now, and it also gives you a lot more flexibility during your phase one because you don't know how the process is going to be able to meet those specs. So if you set them wide enough within regulatory expectations, your chances of failing a batch are lower. And as you get more process experience, you can tighten those specs, and then the CMO will also be more confident that they're able to meet those specs as well as they gain experience around that. But I agree. I think I've used the concept of a defined term as both customer customer fault in capitals and CMO fault. So where there's a clear assignment of fault, that's where the liability should reside. And sometimes it's pretty easy to assign fault. It's very clear who did it and who's responsible for it. In other cases, it's not. Like the example Lily gave on the drug product side, because that is often very difficult. The drug product people, for a typical drug product batch, it's typically a fraction. The cost to do a drug product batch is a fraction of the cost it is to make an API. So they're not going to assume that. However, they understand that if they are at fault, for example, if they take this precious API that took you 9 months to make and is worth millions of dollars, and they mishandle it in their storage or whatever, they are liable. And they understand that. And yeah.
And I think you bring up a really good point I wanted to actually follow up on, and that's where this issue of caps on liability come in, and that's a whole other context to the negotiation, is you can have this really fine document that you've put together, and then you get to the counterparty's comments at the end of the document where you have the caps on liability, and you find that really those wonderful terms you negotiated aren't really worth very much, because the cap is at 5 cents on the dollar. I mean, so it all has to be viewed in a whole, from the whole, a universal perspective. You're looking at all the terms. Yeah.
Exactly, the cap on liability, then the level of insurance that they cover. And it becomes, that's sort of where the technical people say, I throw up my hands, I get the finance people involved, because they need to understand, do they have the insurance policies in place? So if it does happen, I've even had shipments, from Europe to the U.S. of bulk drug substance where it leaked. And so that whole batch, but it wasn't, so it was a CMO's fault, maybe it was the courier or whatever, and so that one was particularly interesting as to where do you define liability and who pays for it, and so it was they assigned it to an insurance, and so basically I think the transporter used their insurance to pay for the repeat of the batch. This is great. So maybe we can start down, and we'll probably have more case studies and war stories. So we can start with you. I don't know if there's one of the things that I think about is, so we talk about delivery. So that's something to me, and it's an assignment of risk. So delivery is often a defined term. So the difference in the Incoterms, X-Works, FCA, really is also a risk perspective, is when do you take possession of the material and therefore are in control of it. And I know the whole industry has moved to X-Works almost exclusively. I don't see FCA, and nobody will ever agree to that. However, that pushes the risk much more onto the client or the customer at this point. But I think there's also creative ways of defining delivery, is the way we've been interpreting the Incoterms. I don't know if we can talk, maybe you're familiar with that, if anybody else is familiar with how Incoterms can be used to at least share the risk burden.
I'm afraid we're not very creative there. It's X-Works, and that means what it means. Now, of course, having said so, we are more than happy to support whatever it takes, whatever is needed to get the product safely to our customer. So we have a lot of experience with packaging stuff and with shipping stuff, and we know who the best shippers are, and we can recommend people. And we can work with the customer to sort of do a risk profile of that shipping and make sure that we manage you through that process. That's a different story, of course, for taking on any liabilities during shipment. So I think, again, it's a matter of sort of drawing a very clear line, saying this is your responsibility. But then as a service, just try to make sure that the customer, that their risks are minimized during that process.
I don't know if anybody else says, that's more the esoteric ones, but if anybody wants to talk.
I think it also depends on, where the product is traveling to, where it's being manufactured. You might have an argument that if, something's being manufactured in India and, needs to go through the import-export, there are lots of, you may have an argument, gee, we need you to be on the hook a little bit longer, or it depends on where it falls in the supply chain. I agree with you that from the CMO side, increasingly we've seen this migration from a willingness to accept FCA or some middle term to it's We're leaving it at the loading dock. Come pick it up.
Right.
So that's the X works, and that's consistently what we're seeing with most CMOs.
Yeah, and just to educate, if people aren't familiar with some of these Incoterms, so one of the risks about using X works is if it's released and delivered, meaning a defined term, that it's no longer under the CMO's responsibility. However, it's still at the CMO. That's where the risk is, because now the sponsor is responsible for it. But let's say, there's a warehouse malfunction and your refrigerators go down and the product gets ruined. Again, to me, that's one of the issues. The sponsor doesn't have the ability to control that situation, yet they're liable for it. And so, it's a huge incentive to get the product out of there as quickly as possible, so you can place it somewhere where you're no longer at risk. The person who actually has control of it is responsible for it. So that's really the incentive, I think, from the CMO perspective. However, that's not always possible to do quickly. So I think there's been some creative terms of defining delivery, and so at least we've been successful using that term to define X work. So delivery could actually be 2 weeks after you've released it or something, so it allows you to get your shipping organized and out of the place. So I think that's...
Patty, just throw one other thing in there as it relates to delivery. Sometimes we see conflating two concepts, which is ownership and delivery. And, of course, there's no one answer across the board. But when we're representing drug companies, we really want to say, you own everything all the way through. It's not ownership on payment. It is not ownership on delivery or taking possession. You own your drug product, intermediates, everything all the way through. Now, sometimes there's a real conversation about this, and, from the CMO perspective, if there's IP being brought to the table, then it's a little bit different. But you want to make sure, that ownership is being treated differently from the concept of delivery or payment.
And I think that's an excellent point, because I think part of that is, unfortunately, this isn't as common as it used to be, but companies do go out of business, and if they go into bankruptcy, and if you don't have clear title or ownership to your material, you can't get it. And there are some examples of that. So that is, I think, pretty clear now, and it's hopefully not too contentious. Maybe certainly not in the bio space. I don't see that, but maybe in the small molecule, or there might be an Indian company or some party that's a little more concerned. If other people have experience in that, I want to talk about the ownership concept and.
It hasn't been a contentious issue for us. We work with our contract manufacturers to try to get the material shipped out of their facilities as quickly as possible. But again, because we're not there, they have much more responsibility for making sure it's done well. But we usually work together with systems that they work with to get the product safely to where it needs to go. Hasn't really been a contentious issue for us.
Well, I want to kind of continue on that theme about ownership, especially around intellectual property and who owns it and who has rights to use it. I think that's an area that I've seen the industry really evolve in a positive way, frankly. So, 20 years ago when I really started working in the CMO area, the CMO really tried to truly own everything, and that was real hard for the sponsors to swallow, because how can you own the process? You're not really at, anybody skilled in the art can do this. And so owning it is, and preventing you from using it for your product, I think was a big issue 20 years ago. I think at least many CMOs now are much more flexible in that space around giving rights, or either, if not ownership. If the CMO owns it, there's full, unencumbered rights, or vice versa. If the product company owns it, anything novel about how to run a column or something, the CMO can use as, to enhance their business. But I'd like to hear the perspective, certainly Cohen, maybe from the CMO perspective, how you've approached it, and then kind of go down again from the panelists.
Yeah, it's always a good debate. Yeah, IP. It's always lots of fun, and usually we work it out, but I think there's a couple of things to keep in mind. So for us, it really depends on what's the starting point. If the customer wants to use some of our background IP, we need to come up with a different solution than when they, for instance, come with an existing process to us and we just do the manufacture. You mentioned that the industry has sort of evolved, and over the 10 years that I've been negotiating these kind of contracts, we have become more relaxed as a CMO. I think in part because everybody sees how difficult it actually is to really come up with some patentable IP around new processes for proteins. There's not that many customers that manage to patent a process. So then you're talking about know-how. For us, my catchphrase is always, we don't want to invent ourselves out of the market. It's very simple. We want to be able, if we come up with a good idea for your product, to use again on a different molecule at least. Yeah. So the best we can give you, customer, is we will not use this bright idea again on the same molecule. Yeah. That's the sort of basic premise. Now, some customers want to go a bit further. They want to talk about a class of molecules. Yeah. Well, we can negotiate that. Yeah. If you're willing to incentivize us for giving you that, that's fine, we can discuss that. Some customers want exclusivity for a whole indication area. Sorry, that's way too broad. So there's always an interesting discussion, and usually you end up with something that is broad enough for the customer that they maintain exclusivity in that area for any new IP. But for anything else, we still want to be doing these creative things 10 years from now. And by the way, dear customer, a lot of the know-how we've built up over the years that we're going to use in your project comes from other customers. So please, bear with us and understand that we need to be able to keep doing that. So always a big debate. In my experience, the IP lawyers love to sort of wordsmith it and come up with exactly the right phrases. The principles usually are not that far off with our customers.
So, we have what we consider platform technologies. So, and we want to be able to use our manufacturing process at potentially multiple different contract manufacturing organizations. And so, we've been very clear in our negotiations that we own the process. But in certain cases, it's become a little contentious in terms of, well, if there's process development work that's going into it, and some of that might require some of the intellectual property or know-how from the contract manufacturer, then what is that contribution? And the way we've tried to work around this is you have to lay it out for us. You have to tell us, is this step something that is proprietary or not? And you have to give us advance notice. We have to decide if we want to do that or not, because that's something that we have to weigh in our decision-making process. And at the end of the day, we often don't get a lot of notifications because it's really usually pretty straightforward stuff that anyone could do if they were skilled in the art.
The majority of my experience in this area is really up at the beginning phases in the cell line development. If you're using somebody's platform vectors and cell lines, or if you're using a commercial system, and a lot of times, if it's a platform system from a CMO, then the terms are fairly rigid around the IP, and I haven't experienced a lot of wiggle room in negotiations. But what's worked for us in the past has been to try and take out whatever negotiating terms in the future in good faith, and try and take those out, and even though you're pretty early in the system, in the process, get as many milestones and tech transfer numbers down that you can, because then that just takes out all of the ambiguity in the future. And that when you hit phase 2, there's this milestone, and nobody's going to argue about it because it's different business guys, it's different legal guys in either company, so it's a little harder to get it done up front, but I think down the line it saves a lot of time.
Thank you. Yeah, so I agree. It's worth the time to invest the time on this issue up front. Neither party, I mean, the basic position is that neither party, the CMO or the drug company, the client, wants to be blocked from doing their business. So the CMO, as Cohen indicated, does not want to be blocked from utilizing IP that it may have developed in the course of performing its services with other clients. That is how its business develops and expands, etc. And as you said, everyone benefits. All clients benefit from that development. The drug company, on the other hand, who has invested, hundreds of millions potentially of dollars in research and development, neither wants to be blocked, especially, it's to add insult to injury. If they've been paying for the development of this IP, they do not want to be blocked from further developing their drug product as it moves forward. And, I'll give one example in the context of a development and manufacturing services agreement where representing the client side, the drug development, the drug company side, the perspective is, look, we're going to own, we each come to the table with our own technology, our own IP. That's clear. Everything developed thereafter, after that point, is owned by the drug company. However, the drug company gives a NERF or a non-exclusive, royalty-free license back to the CMO to utilize, and then here's where the devil shows up. Here's the details. To utilize the license, to utilize that IP for general application in manufacturing. Sometimes it's more narrowly defined. Sometimes, as you've indicated, a field, a product is carved out. Sometimes specific competitors are carved out. So, that's one way that the drug company can rest assured that they have, freedom to operate. They're not going to be blocked. But the CMO has the assurance that the kind of IP that they rely on to develop their business, they will have access to. So,
that's a great point. I've seen contracts where they specifically have an appendix listing companies that so for example, from the product company side, if you partnered or transferred, that these companies will not be given access to this IP. And, it might be half a dozen companies, either because it's a huge competitor or it's from a, part of the world where the IP protection is not strong. So I've seen that where these are exclusively carved out. And then also, a lot of times we talk about tech transfer. Sometimes you might transfer it to a third party just to expand capacity, not necessarily leave the primary CMO, but have a second or tertiary supply. And I've also seen countries added that you cannot transfer to these countries, again, because of the lack of strong IP protection. And
So I think there are other ways as well to, and Cohen, you also kind of brought this idea of kind of sweeten the deal, right? So you're saying, okay, drug company, you don't want us to use this IP? Make us happy, right? What are you going to do for us? And, then you have some options. You can talk about exclusivity, depending on where you are in the development process. Is this an exclusive arrangement? If it's a supply arrangement, then are there minimum purchase obligations? So there are ways to sweeten the deal to make that, that grab, that IP grab, a little less onerous on the CMO.
I think one of the other questions, too, about if just the value of the IP, too, sometimes it's somewhat subjective because, again, skilled in the art, anybody could do it. So I think that is becoming less of an issue. However, there is real IP out there. So Tom used the example of cell line development. There's a lot of very good IP out there, and people use that IP because they are optimistic that it will actually achieve a benefit. I've seen some very creative things. Well, I don't know how much of a benefit it will achieve compared to some of the non-IP, a little slower but certainly less expensive, and sort of having the carrot in there to say, okay, if you achieve, and this goes more towards the royalty aspect, so for a true patented IP where you'd actually owe a royalty on sales, if your technology is really this good, this is the royalty we're willing to pay, as opposed to, it's not so good, we're not going to pay as high a royalty because you have not added value to my product. And I think that's really fair because your IP is only valuable if it adds value. And so I think that's a concept that I'm hoping will start getting traction as opposed to if you use this IP, you owe X percent. Want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think that's a great comment. Yeah. And of course, we have several proprietary technologies. And of course, we would like you to take a license and pay lots of royalties or milestones or whatever. Mm-hmm. But yeah, you need to be convinced that there's value in it. And what several of our customers have done actually is said, okay, give me your term sheet. We're going to start a project based on a basic term sheet. If you can prove to me that actually this is really good what you're doing, you're using your expression technology, those are the terms. Yeah? If not, I'm going to use an off-the-shelf system and forget about it. I may lose a little bit of time, but I don't need an expensive license. Now, if that happens in practice, we'll sit down again and say, really, we all really would like to use our system. Let's just come up with better terms. And you go through the discussion, and then you walk away with a compromise that everybody can live with.
Right. Exactly. It's just, I think it's fair. If you're adding value, you get paid for it. If you're as good or not even as good, then you should get paid extra. I mean, that just seems reasonable. I think both parties would understand that. And I think maybe because we one more question, then we can to the panel, and then we can open it up to the attendees. I wanted to talk a little bit about the negotiating fixed price versus milestone payments, because a lot of times the pricing is something that is fluid. So you get an initial price, and you say, okay, this looks good. You move forward, and then okay, that wasn't included. We didn't think about this. So it's going to change order, and all of a sudden your budget is 3 times higher than you thought. So I'd like to get some thoughts about what are the risks and strategies of going forward with a sort of fixed price type approaches versus just the time and materials or milestone based approaches. Can we start with Cohen and just go?
We like milestones because we go to our customers and we say we are the best CMO. Yeah, like all our other competitors, they say the same thing. Yeah, but we try to convince you we're the best party to work with. So we need to put our money where our mouth is and effectively say, we'll invoice you if we hit certain milestones and we've actually done what we set out to do. Yeah. So we always take a certain risk around the project. We make an estimate how much work it will be. We have a cost model and all that, and we put a certain price on a milestone. And then we say, when that is achieved, we'll invoice you for that. Yeah. Now, of course, at the beginning of a project, our customer also tells us something. Yeah, they'll come to us and say, oh, we have this fantastic process in the lab. It really works well. It gets X yield. Now, what we then do is, okay, let's put it in the contract. That's the starting point. That's what you've told us. Now, if it turns out that what you've told us is actually incorrect, yeah, to use a nice word for it, or porkies, as they like to say in the UK, yeah, then sorry, but then we need to talk. If we hit a milestone, then maybe it's not our fault, because you've told us that the starting point is different from what it actually turned out to be. We need to do that to protect ourselves, because we have customers coming to us to say, we have this fantastic lab-based process. It gives 3 grams per liter, and what it really means is we run it 10 times, and once it gave 3 grams, and 9 times it gave half a gram. Yeah. So you see, there's always that sort of dynamic. The starting point needs to be well defined in a contract. If the starting point turns out to be correct, you've told us the truth, then we take responsibility for hitting those milestones, because we are supposed to be the experts. Of course, there can be change orders. There can be changes. Maybe you change your mind about your spec while we're developing the process. Maybe you want some additional analytical methods that we hadn't quoted for. That's what we have a change order mechanism for.
So I like milestone-based contracts too. I think it aligns both the customer and the client, take the CMO together, which is that we both want to achieve those milestones. You want to achieve that milestone to get paid, and we want to achieve that milestone to move on in our development programs. One of the problems with small biotech is, of course, that it's very sometimes hard to commit to these larger scope of work type milestone contracts, because we don't know if we have enough money to pay for it. And so we're often forced to do things that are more flexible than that, and at earlier stages of development, and so we often have to go with something more time and materials based, because we're only going to be able to get so far until the next funding source comes in, and so there are we have to be more flexible at times, but in general I think milestone contract programs are the way to go.
Yeah, I think that describes my life pretty well. Maybe the one thing I could add is sometimes at the very beginning of a project when you when you're making a cell line, and you don't have that first milestone. I don't know what my productivity is in the bioreactor yet. Some of that work can get done on time and materials with a goal towards hitting a productivity level, and if so, then milestones kick in, and we can have a contract going forward from then where we're dealing on more standard milestone terms.
I don't have a whole lot to add to this one other than, the complexity of the process has a lot to do with it as well, right? And, I find that for a lot of, frankly, for a lot of drug companies, time and materials is the way they prefer to proceed. They can kind of manage their budget a little bit better. There is this question of control. Usually the invoicing is happening a little more frequently when you're doing it that way, and so there's a sense of a little bit more greater control over the process. But it depends on where you are and at what stage, as you indicated, and sometimes it makes total sense, and it depends on how much of a collaborative relationship this is versus, really a pair of hands. Because I would argue where it's a pair of hands who's, doing the manufacturing, you want time and materials, just don't monkey around negotiating milestones. But if it's more of a partnership and there's more development, the CMO is bringing IP to the table, for example, it might make sense to take a milestone-based approach.
Yeah, and I think that is probably the largest approach or the most common approach for at least biologics drug substances today. And part of it is, especially for proteins, antibodies especially, it's fairly well defined, and most of the CMOs know what it takes to do this, and they can price it out pretty well. They're very sophisticated, and I see a lot of different types of proposals, and you can always tell the people who really understand pricing, and you can say, well, they're very tight, they're very similar, they might vary a little bit, and then there's a couple that are like, whoa, they're just you just completely mispriced it, or some that underpriced it so much. And if you see those two, that they don't either understand the process, or you're going to get change ordered to death, or they didn't put stuff in there that they should have. And so those are some of the things that we certainly look for and help, because as part of the negotiation, if you think like anything, you expect certain things as a deliverable and what you're going to get for your money, and then all of a sudden you get this invoice and you didn't get what you thought you were going to get, and those are never the best conversations to have. Okay. Well, we have a few minutes left, and so I wanted to open up questions from the audience. So, we've talked about a lot of different scenarios, so I want to see if anybody in the audience has some specific questions I'd like to pose to the panel, myself. And if you do have a question, if you could please come up to the microphone so everybody can hear. No questions? Are all the answers? Everybody feels like they have a complete negotiation strategy now, and you can see a lot of business deals getting done here at Bio now with all the stuff that you've learned, hopefully. Okay. Are there any parting comments that the panelists would like to make before we wrap up?
I'll throw some free advice in. I would say that one way to kind of do your due diligence. I mean, both parties need to do their due diligence. The CMO needs to do its due diligence on who its clients are, particularly from a financial perspective. But on the drug company side, one way to kind of move the process forward a little bit sometimes is that we've asked, when we're representing the drug company, to have the CMO provide contract with the proposal. When the RFP goes out there, put the request in there. We want to see what your documentation is. Have your legal look at it. Just take a high-level pass. Know who you're dealing with, because sometimes you can have great people on the science and technical side, and then you've got a crazy legal contract that's going to end up delaying, your drug development for 6 months. And that's just ridiculous. So if you know that at the outset, at least you can make an informed decision, know who you're dealing with, and make, a more comprehensive risk assessment. So just throw that out there.
And I'll jump in just one comment before we go down, because I totally agree. One thing I use as a barometer, if it takes more than a day or two to get a CDA in place with a CMO, that is a huge indication of how hard it's going to be to do business with you. So I tell you, if you're in that situation where you can't get CDAs turned around quickly, all of the business development people, you need to have a heart-to-heart with your legal guys and say you're hurting business, because people will just not. They'll just go. They won't continue, because it's that hard to get something like that. So maybe not 2 days, but if a CDA has to be strongly negotiated, that's not a good sign. So that just, again, is an indication of sort of I wouldn't say contentious, but just it is the tail wagging the dog in those types of situations. So they're not focused on the business and the science, they're focused on protection, which is hopefully what we're all getting at.